First up, House File 831 from Representative Long. I will move that House File 831 be referred to the Climate and Energy Finance and Policy Committee. Welcome, Chair Long, and please proceed with explaining your bill.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the committee taking this bill up today. House File 831 would improve our building codes for new commercial buildings. We had an exhaustive process with task force that Governor Walz convened over the past couple of years with a broad number of stakeholders that my testifiers will speak to come up with the draft that we have today. But the bill is pretty straightforward. It would update our building energy efficiency codes for new commercial buildings every 3 years from now until 2036, with the goal of reaching net zero energy in 2036 for the new building construction for commercial buildings. And this would help us meet our state's greenhouse gas goals, which we're currently falling well short of. Buildings are 40% of the energy usage in our state, and even more in some communities. This bill had the support of a broad number of cities who have local greenhouse gas goals that they're really not able to achieve because of the difficulty of getting their hands around energy efficiency for buildings. I'll be brief and stop there, and would love to have us hear from our testifiers.
Thank you, Chair Long. First testifier is Scott D. McClellan, Minnesota Department of Labor and Industry. Mr. McClellan, please recognize or identify yourself for the record and proceed.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. My name is Scott McClellan. I'm the state building official and director of the Construction Codes and Licensing Division for the Department of Labor and Industry. I want to thank you for the opportunity to testify in support of House File 831. The bill before you today is the result of a recommendation or a series of recommendations from a building efficiency work group that was convened by the Departments of Commerce and Labor and Industry in 2019 and 2020. In addition to the work group recommendation, this legislation is also part of the governor's 2021 budget proposals to address climate change, specifically to create more resilient communities. Representative Long's bill takes a statewide approach to energy code improvements so as to ensure that all new commercial and large multifamily buildings that are constructed in the state, beginning in the year 2022, are designed to become progressively more energy efficient until newly constructed buildings become net zero users of energy by the year 2036 and beyond. So this statewide approach addresses concerns by work group members that any new energy regulations maintain uniformity, promote regulatory certainty, minimize complexity. And this approach also takes into account the goal of a coalition of a dozen or so municipalities that approach the department and others wanting to accelerate adoption of energy code requirements to achieve net zero energy by the year 2036. So this legislation aligns with the agency's existing statutory responsibility to comply with the U.S. Department of Energy's mandate that all states adopt new efficient commercial energy codes every 3 years. And as such, the department is currently in the early stages of reviewing the latest commercial energy code, HF831 90.1, for adoption in the year 2022. So this action addresses our current statutory responsibility while satisfying the first step in the recommendations of the report from the work group. But because adoption of the ASHRAE standard alone every 3 years will likely be insufficient to achieve net zero by the year 2036, subsequent code adoptions would need to include an adjusted minimum percent efficiency to meet that goal. Therefore, the legislation before you today is needed to ensure that each future edition of the Commercial Energy Code adopted by Minnesota incorporate a minimum of 8% efficiency every 3 years. So this effort will be assisted by and is complementary to actually technologies already leveraged in 2 existing Minnesota programs, one being the B3 benchmarking, which tracks energy use, costs, and carbon for most public buildings, and the 2030 Sustainable Building Program, an energy standard enacted by the legislature that established similar progressive energy goals for all state bonded projects. In closing, improving energy efficiency on all new commercial multifamily construction means better buildings, lower emissions, and a healthier Minnesota. And the Department of Labor and Industry is pleased to support House File 831. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McClellan, and please stick around if there's any questions. Next testifier is Andy Snope from the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. Mr. Snope, please identify yourself for the record and proceed.
Good afternoon, Chair Eklund and committee members. Thank you for allowing me time to testify today on behalf of House File 831. My name is Andy Snope. I am the Legislative Director for the Local 292 IBEW. We represent roughly 5,000 electrical workers who work throughout the state of Minnesota. IBEW Local 292 supports House File 831. This legislation provides for an accelerated adoption of the latest recommended standards for a statewide energy code for commercial buildings. Building energy efficiency is what our members and the contractors we work for do. We perform work that helps buildings perform better. Electrification, lighting and load control, building automation, building energy management, process control, and HVAC controls are all tasks that our members perform. We are trained to do these tasks, and we continually receive training to update our skills to meet the latest codes and standards. In 2019, we participated in the work group that was structured through the Department of Labor and Industry and the Department of Commerce. After 18 months of work with stakeholders, recommendations were published and distributed. This legislation is a result of these recommendations to create a process in which adoption of energy codes remain a statewide implementation and preserving the established regulatory conformity of the energy codes. This creates a statewide uniformity, predictability that we support, and it also expedites the adoption of the process in which we support for new energy legislation. Thank you very much for allowing me to speak, and I'm available for any questions after this.
Thank you, Mr. Snope. Next up is Richard Graves. Mr. Graves, please identify yourself for the record and proceed.
Thank you, Chair Eklund and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify in support of the bill before you. My name is Richard Graves, and I'm the Director of the Center for Sustainable Building Research at the University of Minnesota. At the center, we manage the B3 and SB 2030 programs for the state of Minnesota, which applies to all state-funded construction. The B3 guidelines include the Sustainable Buildings 2030 Energy and Carbon Standard that is scheduled to reach net zero energy carbon buildings by 2030. A net zero energy building is one that has integrated energy efficiency cost effectively and then selected energy sources that are renewable. I was honored to serve as the technical advisor to the Building Efficiency Work Group formed by the Departments of Commerce and Labor and Industry in 2019 and early 2020. The departments and staff should be commended for their work with stakeholders to achieve consensus on the recommendations. The working group recommended to have the new model energy code follow a similar path to achieve net zero energy for new commercial buildings by 2036. The code trajectory is an important element for new commercial construction in Minnesota's climate action planning. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Graves. And please stick around. Next up, testifying is Elizabeth Turner, AIA, Minnesota. Ms. Turner, please identify yourself for the record and proceed.
Good afternoon, Chair and members of the committee. My name is Elizabeth Turner, and I am an architect and business owner. On behalf of AIA Minnesota's nearly 2,300 architecture and design professionals, I would like to express our support of HF831. Because of programs like SB 2030, which governs energy standards in public buildings, we already know we can build more efficient and resilient buildings in a cost-effective way. SB 2030 is both meeting environmental goals and saving the state $22 million each year in operating costs. This program has accelerated the skills of Minnesota's architects in delivering cost-effective, high-performance buildings through improvements to site orientation, massing, building envelope, and mechanical systems. As architects, we greatly value and respect the code-making process. The Department of Labor and Industry conducts a rigorous and thorough evaluation of building code proposals to make sure they work for Minnesota. We know that even on an accelerated pace, this process will retain its thoughtfulness, take all perspectives into consideration, and keep Minnesota's best interests in mind. Accelerating the statewide energy code preserves the existing uniformity and clarity in our code and ensures every community is on a level playing field. If Minnesota does not more rapidly update its commercial building energy standards, we are setting ourselves up to pay more in the future through costly retrofits and increasing energy assistance funding needs. Today's baseline code building is tomorrow's energy assistance request. When lifetime building costs are considered in addition to first costs, investing in building efficiency upfront makes complete financial sense. However, not all developers and design teams have the time, resources, or interest in doing the necessary modeling on every project. So a statewide commercial energy code that keeps pace with advancements in design and technology would help create a clear pathway to energy efficient buildings for everyone. Accelerating the code will also open new opportunities for job training and the skills that will keep Minnesota's design, contracting, building trades, and engineering professions vital in the decades to come. We need to raise the minimum expectation statewide to give every community an opportunity to build better, high-performing buildings to serve their residents. AIA Minnesota's architects ask for your support. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Turners. Member questions or comments on the bill? Representative Edelson.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Representative Long, for bringing this bill. I was reviewing it and, of course, added my name to it because I was as a co-author. So it's my understanding, I mean, and it sounds like your testifier said it, is that as you improve the energy efficiency, you also reduce cost. And it sounds like that's something that you guys also looked at. I'm curious, when you went with the working group, if they found any states that were leading the way on this as they were looking at how Minnesota was going to implement this.
Chair Long.
Thank you so much for the question, Representative Edelson. Before I answer the question, I just want to note that the city of Edina is one of the cities that's pushed hard for the bill, and we've had a diverse coalition of cities from Rochester to Red Wing to St. Paul who have really been the leaders that have brought this proposal forward. I think the most eloquent answer to your question would come from Richard Graves, who really has a good handle on the perspective of other states, so I'll defer to him.
Mr. Graves.
During the working group, we reviewed work going on in New York, Massachusetts, and also in Canada, in British Columbia, as similar policy models to getting the built environment to meet climate action goals and get to net zero. So,
Representative Edelson.
Thank you, Chair. I was just curious so I could read up more on it. And yes, Representative Long, you are right. It is something that we, via city codes, have taken great efforts in. So I love that this is a statewide bill. So very supportive.
Representative McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Question for perhaps one of the testifiers or even Representative Long. What's to preclude the businesses or the buildings that are being constructed today or even tomorrow from doing this without a state law?
Representative Long, or the Chair Long, or the testifiers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the question, Representative McDonald. So certainly buildings can go above code if they want to, and they can build more efficient buildings, and many are. But we know that as a state, we've set goals for ourselves for our greenhouse reduction that we need to achieve, and we're not on track to meet those. So this is an effort to try to help our state get on track with one of the large sources of energy consumption, which is our commercial buildings.
Representative McDonald.
Good, fair enough. Thank you. See, one of the testifiers also mentioned that if we don't do this now, it could be more costly in the future because retrofitting buildings. But in this particular piece of legislation, there is no clawback, if you will, regarding retrofitting if this does not become law. So just curious as to, with your bill, Representative Long, there's no clawback, there's no retrofitting of pre-existing buildings, but one of the testifiers said that if we don't do this now, it could be more costly because of retrofitting. So the two has a little bit of a dichotomy there, if you will. Can you explain?
Chair Long.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that the comment was just that it's cheaper to do it at the front end than to retrofit a building. And you're correct, this bill does not apply to existing buildings. This is only for new construction. And so it would, I think, as you heard from the architects, create predictability for builders and others looking for knowing what the energy efficiency codes are going to be for the next 15 years.
Representative McDonald.
That's all I have for now, Mr. Chair. Thank you. Thank you, Representative Long.
Representative Raleigh.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've got two areas of question. Can the author define what net zero is trying to get to? Because I'm trying to understand, is it net zero energy? Is it net zero carbon, or is it all of the above? Thank you.
Chair Long.
Thank you for the question, Representative Raleigh. I think Mr. Graves spoke to that. So it's net zero emissions. So
Emissions.
if you first you would take all of the cost-effective energy efficiency that you could for the building, and then at that point, if there was a renewable energy source, for example, that was more cost-effective than having energy efficiency, then that would be the next step in the process.
Representative Raleigh.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So that leads me to the question of, is it net zero during construction and during the maintenance phase in the out years? Is it one or the other, or is it both?
Chair Long.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Representative Raleigh. That's a good question. I think Mr. Graves can probably answer that more succinctly than me.
Mr. Graves.
It would be net zero in operation. So after construction, during future years of operations, the building would be, generating all the energy it used from renewable sources.
Representative Raleigh.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And final question on this: if during the course of operation, so we're going to line out during construction, and we're going to be paying attention to operation and maintenance phase. During that phase, if a building is not able to have, like, let's say, renewable energy or whatever, how would they attain a net zero? Are you contemplating things like carbon offsets, or what's the general approach if the energy efficiencies are not available for a particular building, Mr. Chair?
Chair Long.
Thank you for the question, Representative Raleigh. So I think that would be part of the rulemaking that the Department of Labor and Industry would likely undergo, and that would be a rulemaking that would be about 12 years out, but maybe Mr. McClellan would be interested in speaking to that.
Representative Raleigh.
Sure, Mr. Chair, Representative, right, through rulemaking, each 3-year cycle, we'd be putting together a proposal of amendments that would use technology to gain a minimum efficiency every 3-year cycle. And when we started to approach the year 2036, that there will become a point where additional technology features for efficiency will need to rely on renewables. So at that point, that's when renewable energy would need to kick in to complete that net zero design of the building. And in the process, when that is being anticipated, the designers of the buildings, the engineers that are designing it, will model the building to determine the best way to accomplish that. And the hope is then once they get into the operational phase, then the building will actually produce net zero. So thank you.
Representative Raleigh.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Detmer.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. And it's been brought up in the testimony that there's no net zero with the construction of the buildings. I see that. And has anybody figured out what the increase of cost for operating the building after it's constructed to meet the net zero by 2036? Is there some figures out there what it's going to cost more for the businesses that operate the buildings, that own the buildings? And that's a good question that people are going to ask. Those are the types of emails I'll probably get as a legislator.
Chair Long.
Thank you for the question, Representative Detmer. Mr. Graves has been tracking costs and can answer that well.
Mr. Graves.
So operating costs would be reduced because they would be generating energy and generating their own energy, and so they would be saving in their electrical bills and gas bills because of efficiency and production. What would be increased is the initial capital construction costs. And what we've seen in the SB 2030 program, we're currently doing buildings in the state bonded construction that would be equivalent to the code in 2030. The increased capital construction costs are about 2% for that code level. We'd have to see, as it becomes statewide, all the buildings statewide would increase the scale of construction, and some of those increased capital costs would come down because you'd be doing more buildings. So it remains to be seen what the increased capital construction costs would be in 2033 and 2036.
Representative Detmer.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. And what type of energy sources are we talking about? Are we going to have windmills? Are we going to have solar on top of buildings? Or what energy and what backup energy we're going to have? You saw what happened down in Texas, and we're this, that they weren't ready for that. What happened down there? But what type of energy sources are we talking about?
Chair Long.
Thank you for the question, Representative Detmer. So just to put a fine point on it, we're talking about buildings that are for the net zero portion. These are buildings that are 15 years out. So in the near term, we're talking about buildings really only using energy efficiency to achieve the goals. But when we're getting towards net zero, that's when you would be turning over to renewable energy. And so most likely it would be solar. That's what we've seen on most buildings. And in terms of grid reliability, having locally produced solar on buildings in our state actually increases reliability to have that created close to customer load. So that's a positive from a grid standpoint.
Representative Detmer.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess I'll leave it as that. So
I'm not seeing any other member questions. We'll give it a minute. There is a little bit of time just to make sure. Representative McDonald.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a question. Certainly, I'm in an old 100-year-old building, and I mentioned this to the good architects that I spoke with earlier this week, and it's certainly all for energy efficiency. If you can imagine the cost of my energy in this 100-year-old building with 15-foot ceilings, not that you can see it right now. But if this is definitely going to be energy saving for the buildings and the building owners and passed on to the occupants, wouldn't you believe, Representative Long, that this is something that wouldn't have to be a state mandate? Because if there is indeed the efficiency where it's going to save on your energy bill, then naturally the builder and owners of the building would do this naturally without state interference of a state mandate. Wouldn't you agree with me?
Representative Long.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the question, Representative McDonald. So when folks are building buildings, there's a couple of things that they take into account, and sometimes there's a different incentives for the builders and for the owners. So while it might be cheaper to own the building if it's more efficient, such as yours, you'd probably want to have a building that's more efficient to own. Sometimes that's not what the builders are looking at. They're looking at just the upfront cost. And for, as Mr. Graves pointed out, just a small increase in upfront costs, the overall cost of operating and maintaining the building goes down pretty dramatically. And so the payback for a lot of these things can be pretty quick, but it's that sort of split incentive between the building owner and the building and the builder itself that creates a challenge. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we also, I think, need to help continue to educate folks about these types of technologies. Some of them are new and some of them are just being rolled out. But I think once we've seen builders use them, like with the SB 2030 program, then we get a lot more comfort with them. And we've seen a lot of folks be willing to use them more readily.
Representative McDonald.
Then real quickly, Mr. Chair, Mr. Representative Long, if the energy savings does not really justify the cost of the buildings, the extra cost to build it down the road, then do they get a refund, if you will, because of the state mandate from Dolly or Department of Labor? Or
Chair Long.
I know it's something you can answer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't believe there's a mechanism for a refund, but I will note that the way that the net zero works in other states, and as Mr. Graves testified with SB 2030, is that you're using all of the cost-effective energy efficiency before you're going to renewable energy. So when you are, if you reach the point of where it's no longer cost-effective to do energy efficiency, which is some of the work that Mr. Snope and his employees do, then you would be turning to renewable energy. And right now, solar energy is getting cheaper every year, and within the next 5 years, folks anticipate it'll be the cheapest energy available. So I'm not particularly concerned about the costs for builders. I think this will be a win-win.
Representative McDonald.
That's all I have, Mr. Chair.
Seeing no other questions or comments, final words, Chair Long.
Thank you so much, Chair Eklund, for hearing the bill. I'm very pleased with where we were able to come after a lot of hard work to bring this coalition together and find a path forward, and grateful for the committee hearing it today.
I will renew my motion that House File 831 be referred to the Climate and Energy Finance and Policy Committee. Ms. Doyle, please take the roll.
Chair Eklund?
Yes.
Eklund, aye. Vice Chair Zhang, excused. Representative Detmer?
Nay.
Detmer, nay. Representative McDonald?
McDonald, nay.
McDonald, nay. Representative Berg?
Berg, aye.
Berg, aye. Representative Bliss?
Nay.
Bliss, nay. Representative Edelson?
Aye.
Edelson, aye. Representative Frederick?
Aye.
Frederick, aye. Representative Greenman?
Aye.
Greenman, aye. Representative Nelson?
Nelson, aye.
Nelson, aye. Representative Poston?
No.
Poston, nay. Representative Raleigh?
Raleigh, nay.
Raleigh, nay. Representative Sundin?
Aye.
Sundin, aye. And there are 7 ayes, 5 nays.
There being 7 ayes and 5 nays, the motion's passed and the bill's on its way. Representative Long, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Members, next bill on the agenda is House File 600. I will move that House File 600 be referred to the Workforce and Business Development, Finance and Policy Committee. Representative Winkler, we have the A8 authors amendment. Would you like to explain the amendment?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, the A8 amendment updates the bill to reflect in the first section that veterans should not need to send medical records to the Cannabis Management Board in order to qualify for the medical cannabis program. So we make that correction. Second part of the amendment essentially changes the bill so that existing apprenticeship programs and systems